Well, good afternoon, brethren, and happy Sabbath to you all. A big welcome to everyone here, including some of our visitors here I can see, and those joining us too on the webcast. Now, it's been some time since my last message on the Ten Commandments in this series that I've been going through. Now, my last message was on the fifth commandment, which brought us to the halfway mark in the series. Now, today in this next message on the series on the Ten Commandments, we're going to look at the sixth commandment. Now, the sixth commandment is given to us in verse 13 of Exodus 20, where God commands the following: "You shall not murder." Now, murder is the ultimate expression of how we can hate and hurt our neighbour. Now, the Hebrew word used here for murder is the word ratzak. Now, in English, we have separate words for murder and manslaughter. Now, in the Hebrew, the same word ratzak is used for both murder and manslaughter, and you can only tell the difference by looking at it in context. Now, as we go through the statutes that deal with both, we'll see that the Bible does make a difference between the two, despite using the same Hebrew word, and we'll also see a difference in the punishment for the two. Now, in English, the word murder is used for intentionally and unlawfully taking someone's life. Now, in Western law, lawfully taking the life of another includes executing a criminal worthy of death, killing someone in self-defence, and legitimate warfare. Now, in English, the term manslaughter is used for accidentally taking someone's life. Now, our English word kill covers taking a life in all its various different forms: murder, killing in self-defence, executing a criminal, as well as manslaughter. Now, if you've watched any crime or law shows, you'll probably be familiar with the terms first, second, and third degree murder. Now, just what do we mean by these different classifications of murder? Well, first degree murder is where the act of murder is intentional and premeditated, meaning it was planned prior to the act. Now, second degree murder is where there is intention to murder the victim, but they didn't plan it prior to the act. Now, this is often referred to as a crime of passion. Now, third degree murder is where someone intentionally harms someone without the intent to kill them, but that person ends up dying anyway. Now, the term third degree murder is sometimes used for deaths caused by reckless and negligent behaviour without the intent to kill, though that is more a case of manslaughter. Now, just as there are different types of murder, there are also different types of manslaughter where a life is taken accidentally. There is intentional manslaughter, which is third degree murder, where someone intentionally harms someone without the intent to kill them, but they end up dying anyway. Then there is reckless or negligent manslaughter, where someone's reckless or negligent behaviour causes a death. For example, someone who's drink driving and they accidentally kill someone in the process. Now, the last category of manslaughter is unintentional manslaughter, where a freak accident where there is no negligence causes a death. Now, there are many statutes that relate to the sixth commandment in the Torah. So let's take a look at some of the ones that directly deal with murder. Now, the very first one comes in Genesis chapter 9, soon after the flood, where we read in verses 5 and 6, "Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man." Now, if an animal or a man kills a man, God will demand a reckoning. They will be executed by man. Now, the implication is that the executor is not guilty of bloodshed when executing justice on behalf of God. Now, taking another's life is to terminate someone made in the very image of our Creator, with the potential to become a part of the God family. Now, the next statute we'll look at is Exodus 21, verses 12 to 14, where we read, "He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. However, if he did not lie in wait, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbour to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar that he may die." So we see here a distinction between murder and manslaughter in regards to the penalty. Now for death, it was death for a murder. For manslaughter, it was having to live in a city of refuge. Now the next statute we'll look at is Leviticus 24:17, which says, "Whoever kills a man shall surely be put to death." And in Deuteronomy 19 verses 11 to 12 we read, "But if anyone hates his neighbour, lies in wait for him, rises against him and strikes him mortally so that he dies, and flees to one of these cities, then the elders of his city shall send and bring him from there and deliver him over to the hand of the avenger of blood that he may die." So there were cities of refuge for manslaughter, but if the act is known to be murder, the murderer was to be handed over to be executed. Now in Exodus 21 verses 28 and 29, we read of a case of negligent murder. Now if a man has an ox that has been known to thrust, and he was told about it, and he hasn't confined him properly, and it kills someone, he shall also be put to death as well as the ox. Now Deuteronomy 21 verses 1 to 9 is the law of how to deal with unsolved murder. A heifer was sacrificed, an appeal made to God directly to avenge the victim, since God would know who the murderer was. Now, after doing all that they could to solve the mystery, this ritual was an act of faith to trust God to directly avenge the murder on behalf of the victim's family. Now, God also gave a statute in Numbers 5 to help deter instances of second-degree murder that were crimes of passion. Now, if there is strong suspicion by a husband that his wife has been secretly unfaithful, she is to be brought to the priest and made to drink holy water with dust, which is not harmful by itself, and to ask God to cause a visible reaction to it if she is guilty. Now, this ritual was another act of faith to trust God to give a clear answer of guilt or innocence. Now in Deuteronomy 17 verses 6 to 7 we read, "Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. The hand of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hands of all the people." So we see here that God gives permission to the witnesses and those involved in the trial to terminate the life of the one convicted of the death penalty. Now, there are no statutes that deal directly with killing in self-defence. Now, the closest to it is Exodus 22 verses 2 and 3, which says, "If the thief is found breaking in, and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. If the sun has risen on him, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed." So we see here that there was no guilt for killing a thief that has broken into your house if it was dark, and presumably one felt that one's family's life was in danger. Now, if, however, it was daylight and the thief wasn't threatening you or your family's life, and you killed him anyway, then it would count as murder. Now, Deuteronomy 20, God gave statutes that dealt with warfare. Now, this related to warfare against people that God had decreed as enemies of Israel because of their actions. Now, Israel couldn't just declare war against anyone that they felt like. They had to be enemies that God had pronounced. Now, God here first deals with warfare against cities and nations beyond the land that he had promised them. An offer of peace was to be made first. If they agreed, they would come under tribute to Israel. Now, if they refused, all the males were to be killed, but the women and children would be theirs as spoils of war to be their servants. Now, God then goes on to say, "But of the cities of these peoples which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them. Now, as noted by Rushdoony in the Institutes of Biblical Law, he writes, the iniquity of the Canaanites was full or total in God's sight. Prostitution, child sacrifice, and homosexuality had become religious practices to the point where the people were entrenched in depravity and proud of it. Accordingly, God sentenced them to death and made Israel the executor. God's pity for them and his patience had lasted for centuries. Now the time for pity was gone, and it was time for judgment and death. End of quote. Now over in Numbers 33:52 it says, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you. Now that Hebrew word that's translated as drive out means to dispossess. Now the dispossession of the Canaanites was to be done not by exile, but by the way spoken of here in Deuteronomy 20. Now it must of course be remembered that those who would die at the hands of the Israelites by God's decree will, in the next second of their consciousness, come up in the second resurrection spoken of in Ezekiel 37 and Revelation 20, when Christ will rule the whole world. Now at that time, when Christ will rule the world, they will have the opportunity to turn from their evil and become converted. Now Deuteronomy 23 verse 39 and 1 Samuel 2:6 both say that the Lord kills and makes alive. Now, Numbers 35, it notes that 6 cities were set aside as cities of refuge. If you accidentally killed someone, you had to go to one of these cities of refuge. Now, if you ventured away from that city before the death of the high priest, the avenger of blood, who was someone appointed by the victim's family, could lawfully kill you if they desired vengeance over the accidental death. Now, a couple more laws relating to manslaughter are in the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 19:4-6, we have a case of manslaughter from a freak accident. Now, we see that it's treated as different from murder or from negligent manslaughter, as the manslayer here is declared as not being deserving of death, though his freedom is, however, much restricted, which acts as a deterrent to avoid anything that might lead to accidental death. Now, we also read in Deuteronomy 22:8 a building code that God gave to protect from accidental death. When you build a new house, then you shall make a guardrail for your roof. Now, we know in ancient times that people had flat roofs and often would spend time upon the roofs. So not having a railing could actually lead to an accidental death. Now, there are also statutes that deal with the spirit of the law against murder, such as those that deal with physical assault. Now, in Exodus 21, it states that if someone is injured, then the person causing the injury shall pay for the loss of his time working and all his medical expenses. Now, any bodily harm caused by a master to one's servant also results in the servant going free. And then in Leviticus 24, verses 19-20, if someone causes a permanent injury, it says, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, and tooth for tooth. Now, Albert Barnes notes the following about this often misunderstood expression. It has in its root a simple conception of justice and is found in the laws of many ancient nations. It serves in this place as a maxim or limit for the magistrate in awarding the amount of compensation to be paid for the infliction of personal injury. The sum was to be as nearly as possible to the worth in money of the power lost by the injured person. End of quote. Now in Leviticus 19:18 we read, you shall take no vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbour as yourself. I am the Lord. Now, the idea of not taking personal, private vengeance and loving one's neighbour are both Old Testament commands, not just New Testament ideas. Now, when Paul talks about not taking personal vengeance, he goes straight on to say in the next chapter in Romans 13 that God has given civil governments legitimate authority to be bearers of God's justice. Now, there is due process which must be followed by the state to execute vengeance on our behalf for criminal matters. Now, there are authorities such as the police and the court system to execute that justice whenever it's needed. Now, if they fail to deliver that justice, we're able to then appeal to the higher court of God's justice in heaven and trust him to execute vengeance on our behalf in his timing. Now, when it comes to lesser matters that are not criminal offences, Paul encourages us to use kindness as a way to soften the hearts of our enemies and to not allow bitterness to infect our own heart. Now, such kindness doesn't mean we put ourselves or our loved ones in harm's way, though. Now, we have three choices when someone hurts us. A, we can return the hurt. B, we can avoid returning the hurt and nothing else. Or C, we can avoid returning the hurt and actively do good to those who hurt us. Now, Paul here tells us to do option C, do good, so we don't become overcome with evil and bitterness. Now, many times, though, we live in option B, not option C. We might not return hurt for hurt, but we do nothing positive either. Now, one of the saddest and most awful forms of murder in our Western society today is that of abortion, where the life of an unborn child is terminated. Now, in his article series, Oh, How I Love Thy Law, Norm Edwards makes these comments about abortion. He says, the ancient Israelites sacrificed their children believing the false gods would give them prosperity for doing so. Now today, few people sacrifice their children directly to Moloch, but millions sacrifice their children on the altar of convenience, the convenience of sex without commitment. We live in a bizarre world indeed. A woman could walk into a hospital nursery, see her tiny newborn premature baby of only 6 months gestational age, open its incubator, cut him up, and throw him away and receive the death penalty for her heinous crime. In an office next door, a woman can walk in with an unborn baby of exactly the same gestational age, let a professional doctor cut him up and throw him away, and not be in violation of any of man's laws. End of quote. Now, the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 6:19-20, do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? For you were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. Now, based on that verse, it could be argued that suicide is unlawfully killing someone just like murder. Now, God owns us, and only God has the right to determine when our time on this earth is finished. Now, the spirit of this commandment in relation to suicide can also include harmful practices to our body like alcoholism, self-harm, smoking, and substance abuse. Now, following on from that, euthanasia, where a life is terminated to put an end to a person's physical suffering, is a hot topic in today's Western world. Now, for a Christian, we live our life by faith and trust God with building his character in us. Now, quite a number of members in the church today suffer from considerable ongoing chronic pain, both physical and emotional, which can be a terrible burden to bear. Now, the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13, no temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape so that you may be able to bear it. Now, Paul says here that we're to trust him, that he knows our limits and will provide a way of escape. Now, that way of escape can be the capacity to cope and bear with pain both physically and also emotionally, as he uses it to build his character in us. It also includes trusting him to take care of closing our life's innings at his timing and not prematurely take matters into our own hands. Now, why do we have such problem with murder and violence in our world? Well, the Apostle James answers that question in James 4 verses 1 and 2, where he says, "Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war." Now, to the Pharisees whose envy of Jesus led to his death on the cross, Jesus said, "You are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth." Now, Satan broadcasts impulses that imperceptibly plant suggestions in our mind to be selfish and hurt others to advance our own agenda and what we want. We need God's Spirit to deal with the human nature in us that pushes us towards being selfish, which often leads to harming others both physically as well as emotionally with our words. Now, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount discussed the spirit of the sixth commandment. Now, talking about Jesus' familiar statements, David Guzik writes the following: Jesus makes it clear that it's not only those who commit the act of murder who are in danger of judgment. Those who have a murderous intent in heart are also in danger of judgment. Now, Barclay, commenting on the ancient Greek word translated angry, says, "So God forbids forever the anger which broods, the anger which will not forget, the anger which refuses to be pacified, the anger that seeks revenge." The Mosaic law commanded you to love your neighbour, yet some teachers in the days of Jesus added an opposite, an evil misapplication, an equal obligation to hate your enemy. They generally looked upon all the uncircumcised as not their neighbours, but their enemies, whom the precept did not oblige them to love. Instead, Jesus reminds that in the sense God means it, all people are our neighbours, even our enemies. To truly fulfill this law, we must love, bless, do good, and pray for our enemies, not only our friends. Jesus understood that we will have enemies, yet we are to respond to them in love, trusting that God will protect our cause and destroy our enemies in the best way possible by transforming them into our friends. End of quote. Now, the whole story of the Bible is the story of God acting in just such a way. Even while we were sinners, he sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to save us from our sins, and he has commanded us to be like him in every way possible. Now, many years ago, I went to see Chuck Misler when he was speaking here in Brisbane. Now, before he came along, they had a very interesting earlier speaker, Walid Shabat, who had a fascinating life story. He was actually a former Palestinian terrorist who later converted to Christianity. Now, he said one thing that was a major factor in his conversion was when he came across Jesus' statement to love your enemies. Now, that same verse also had a profound impact on the son of a Hamas co-founder who has vigorously spoken out against the murderous Hamas terrorist group. Now, we must keep in mind that every human being, even the worst of people in this age, is still a potential son and daughter of God. So in summary, murder is intentionally taking another's life. It is forbidden and, according to God's law, punishable by death. Unlawfully taking a life can include abortion, euthanasia, and suicide. Manslaughter, the accidental taking of a life, could be punishable by death if negligence was involved, or, if not, confinement to a city of refuge until the death of the high priest. Now, God has given civil governments legitimate authority to be the bearers of God's justice. Now, when it comes to lesser matters that are not criminal offences, we are to use kindness as a way to soften the hearts of our enemies and not allow bitterness to infect our own heart. And Jesus makes it clear that breaking the sixth commandment is not just committing the act of murder, but also having hatred in our heart towards others. We are to hate their sins, but love and want God's best for those individuals. So let's all be a people committed to loving all people and keeping the spirit of the sixth commandment.